Thank you.
Thank you. Kenny MacAskill.
Thank you, Mr Dowd. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and like others, I pay tribute to my party leader and colleague for a very forensic examination, and I pay tribute to Declassified UK for the information that they have provided. It is appropriate that we should be debating this because it's something that we must never, ever forget. It's ironic that actually today I noticed in social media that this is the anniversary of Saddam Hussein being discovered in his hiding and the dishevelled despot being brought out. I have to say I have a moral objection to the death penalty, but I think, like everybody else, I shed no tears for Saddam Hussein. He was a deeply evil man, although I do think it would have been better had he been brought to trial at the International Criminal Court in terms of normal rules than simply hung. Because the consequences of the Iraq War, as was said by the member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, live with us and reverberate with us to this day. We were taken into war on a false prospectus. We were taken in on deceit and indeed on lies, and it's important that that should be brought to account, because the world is a far less safe place from that war that has been come about. Millions have died, not simply in that country, but around the world. A refugee crisis that we now see and live with was kicked off and has continued. And perhaps also more worryingly, the moral authority of the Western democracies has been lost, and you can trace it back to the war in Iraq. That is something that I'll go on to comment about. I have some sympathy for the Minister because he is having to deal with the sins of a different administration. But as has been mentioned by others, the Tories were joined at the hip with Labour in this war and have to take account for the consequences, even if the principal villain was Tony Blair. There were those, and people's names have been mentioned. And indeed, there are two in particular who I think we should thank for their actions. Robin Cook has been mentioned, was deeply principled. I knew Robin Cook. I stood against him. I disagreed with his position in the constitutional status of Scotland. But nobody should forget the courage, not just the courage he had, but the convictions that he retained. And in speaking out against the Iraq War, we should never forget him. And it's a tragedy that he's not here with us today. Equally, Charles Kennedy spoke out against the Iraq War. He was indeed decried for it, but it was principled. I recall marching with Charles Kennedy in Glasgow when over 100,000 people in Scotland marched, as indeed they marched in London and in other cities, not simply across the UK, but across the world, to say, this is not in our name. But Tony Blair took us to war despite the objection of principled people like Cook and Kennedy, and despite the millions marching across the United Kingdom, and we live with those consequences today. But where is the accountability? Yes, we've had Chilcot. Yes, we've had some matters put out there, but nobody has been held to account. We were told it was weapons of mass destruction. We were told we were only minutes away from doom and gloom, and indeed the death of democracy, the death of humanity almost, it was portrayed, and that was shown to be a lie. It was the same lie that was perpetrated about going into Afghanistan, the United States, when they said it was all about 9/11, when it was quite clear if they were going to deal with the perpetrators of 9/11, it was Saudi Arabia that you should be addressing. But as with Khashoggi, people turned a blind eye to an ally, or indeed one, as with the United Kingdom, one that you view as a bankrolling your armaments industry. So, as I say, it was formed on a strategic lie. It was done for oil, access to oil, and indeed for wider geopolitical positions. But the problem is that we have to live with it today, and the consequences do reverberate, and in particular, that brings back, as is often mentioned in political debates, the quote by Santayana, that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it, because repeating it we have been, and repeating it we are. We have seen the disaster that has befallen Ukraine, but we worry why and wonder why 85% of the globe hasn't signed up for sanctions against Russia, and I believe there should be sanctions against Russia. I condemn Putin for the invasion, even if I think that some actions have been taken have been wrong, and I don't support the actions of the United States. But let's remember that at the end of the day, the rest of the world is not seeing this the same eyes as we are, because they're saying, where's your moral authority when you were prepared to go into Iraq and you now condemn Putin? We are paying the price for Blair's folly. Equally, I have to say, I also remember the criticism, rightly so, of Wagner. But what was the precursor of Wagner? The precursor of Wagner was BlackRock.
Yep.
Because let's remember, after Iraq, we privatised war. We saw war privatised, and we saw basically private militias that made a lot of money for individuals come in and take over something that had previously been dealt with by a military representing the state. So before Wagner came on the scene, it was BlackRock, and that affected us. It wasn't just a corporation in the United States. I met young Scottish soldiers who told me about colleagues of theirs who were actually deliberately failing drug tests because it was actually better to go and be paid 100,000, as you were getting, to go and be militia or contractors. And let's remember, when we talk about contractors in places like Iraq, they weren't bricklayers, they weren't scaffolders, they were soldiers carrying out private work for what America and indeed the UK carried out. That was the precursor, as I say, that started with what Blair did, and we were there ready, and it lived with us, and we have to face those consequences. Now, of course, we have Gaza, and we see the Western democracies again failing to speak out. We see the UK abstain, and we see the United States object, and you wonder why countries such as South Africa, such as Brazil, are looking at the Western world and saying, who are you to lecture us? Who are you to go on about Putin? Who are you to go on about the sins of Saddam Hussein when you are prepared to turn a blind eye to what you do in funding and supporting the Israeli Defence Forces? All of that comes back, and that's why there has to be honesty. That's why there has to be accountability, because Iraq has fundamentally damaged not just the United Kingdom, it has damaged Western democracy. We were lied to as a people. The objections of the people that were vociferous, where people marched in the hundreds of thousands, were literally ignored by executive diktat. That mustn't be allowed to be repeated, and that's why we need to get these documents out there. And those who perpetrated this sin, and it was a mortal sin, must be and should be held to account.
Thank you. Carl Turner.